Daniel Rodriguez pulled his daughter's pink unicorn blanket closer to his chest, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of her strawberry shampoo. His beat-up Honda Civic creaked as he shifted position in the driver's seat, trying to find comfort where none existed. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m., and through the foggy windows, he could see the neon sign of Murphy's Diner flickering in the distance. He'd been parked behind the small-town establishment for 3 nights now, hoping nobody would notice the man sleeping in his car. His stomach growled, a hollow reminder that his last meal had been a gas station sandwich 2 days ago. But when a tiny fist knocked on his window, and he saw a little girl standing there with a steaming bowl of soup, tears streaming down her face, he had no idea this moment would transform not just his life, but the entire community of Millbrook. One act of kindness was about to create a ripple effect that would touch dozens of lives, but first, Daniel had to find the courage to accept help when he needed it most. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had been a line cook at Romano's Italian restaurant, earning just enough to cover rent on his small apartment and provide for his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady was all Daniel needed. He'd been working double shifts, sometimes staying until 2 a.m. to prep for the next day, all while making sure Emma had everything she needed. His ex-wife, Patricia, had left them when Emma was just 3, claiming she wasn't ready for the responsibility of motherhood. Since then, it had been just Daniel and Emma against the world, and they'd built a life together filled with Saturday morning pancakes, bedtime stories, and the kind of unconditional love that only comes from facing hardship together. The layoff came without warning. Romanos was struggling financially, and despite Daniel's perfect attendance record and willingness to work any shift, he was among the first to go. The restaurant owner, Mr. Romano, had tears in his eyes when he handed Daniel his final paycheck, explaining that the pandemic had hit small businesses hard and they simply couldn't afford to keep everyone on staff. Daniel shook his hand, thanked him for the opportunity, and walked out into the cold March air with a heavy heart and a growing sense of panic. Emma was staying with her maternal grandmother, Margaret, in the neighboring town of Riverside for spring break. Margaret had insisted on taking Emma for 2 weeks, giving Daniel what she called a well-deserved break. At the time, Daniel had been grateful for the gesture, thinking it would give him time to pick up extra shifts and save some money. Now, without a job and with Emma safe at her grandmother's, Daniel felt both relief and crushing loneliness. At least Emma wouldn't have to see him at his lowest point. The first few days after losing his job, Daniel had thrown himself into job searching with the determination of a man who had everything to lose. He applied to every restaurant, grocery store, and retail shop within a 30-mile radius. He updated his resume, practiced interview questions in the mirror, and even considered taking a job at a fast food chain despite being overqualified. But each rejection felt like another weight added to his shoulders. Some employers were honest about not hiring, others simply never called back, and a few made it clear that they were looking for younger workers who wouldn't require the same level of pay. By the end of the first week, Daniel's savings account was nearly empty. He'd been living paycheck to paycheck for so long that he'd never been able to build a substantial emergency fund. The rent on his apartment was due in 10 days, and he was already behind on his car insurance. He'd sold his television, his laptop, and most of his furniture, but even that wasn't enough to cover his basic expenses. The electricity had been shut off 2 days ago, and he'd been showering at the local community center, pretending to use their fitness facilities. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, taped to his door like a scarlet letter of failure. Daniel read it 3 times, each reading making the words feel more real and more devastating. He had 72 hours to vacate the premises or face legal action. Standing in his empty apartment, surrounded by the few belongings he had left, Daniel felt the weight of complete and utter defeat. He'd worked so hard to build a stable life for Emma, and now it was all crumbling around him. That night, Daniel loaded his remaining possessions into his Honda Civic. A few changes of clothes, important documents, a photo of Emma from her last birthday, and the pink unicorn blanket she'd forgotten during her last visit. He drove aimlessly through the small towns that dotted the rural landscape, trying to process what had happened and figure out what to do next. The car was his only shelter now, his only protection from the elements and the judgment of others. He'd chosen to park behind Murphy's Diner for several reasons. The location was secluded enough that he wouldn't draw attention from passers-by, but close enough to the main road that he felt relatively safe. The diner seemed like a family-owned establishment, the kind of place where the owners might be understanding if they discovered him. Most importantly, the smell of food that wafted from the kitchen reminded him of better times, when he'd been the one creating those comforting aromas for others. The first night in the car had been the hardest. Daniel had tried to sleep sitting up, but his back ached and his legs cramped. Every sound made him jump, worried that someone would discover him and call the police. He'd dozed fitfully, waking every hour or so to check his surroundings. The cold seeped through the car's thin metal walls, and he'd wrapped Emma's blanket around himself, trying to capture some warmth and comfort from the familiar fabric. During the day, Daniel would drive to the public library to use their computers and continue his job search. He'd shower at the community center, wash his clothes at the laundromat, and try to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But as the days passed, he felt himself becoming more invisible, more disconnected from the world around him. People looked through him rather than at him, and he began to understand how easy it was to slip through the cracks of society. The hunger was the worst part. Daniel had been skipping meals for weeks, but now, with no kitchen and limited funds, he was surviving on whatever he could afford from gas station convenience stores. His stomach had started to adapt to the constant emptiness, but the weakness was becoming harder to ignore. He'd catch himself staring at the diner's windows, watching customers enjoy their meals, and feel a longing that went beyond simple hunger. On the third night, as Daniel settled into his makeshift bed in the back seat, he allowed himself to think about Emma. She'd be coming home from her grandmother's in 4 days, and he had no idea what he was going to tell her. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that daddy doesn't have a home anymore? How do you maintain their faith in your ability to protect and provide when you can't even provide for yourself? The thought of disappointing Emma was more devastating than any physical discomfort he was experiencing. The knock on his window came at exactly 11:52 p.m., just as Daniel was drifting off to sleep. The sound was soft but insistent, like a bird tapping at glass. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but the knocking continued, accompanied by a small voice saying, "Mister? Mister, are you okay?" Daniel sat up slowly, his heart pounding as he tried to focus on the figure outside his window. The streetlight cast long shadows, making it difficult to see clearly, but he could make out the silhouette of a child. When he rolled down the window, he found himself face to face with a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She had curly auburn hair that caught the light from the diner's neon sign, and her eyes were wide with concern. In her small hands, she held a ceramic bowl that was almost too big for her to manage, steam rising from whatever was inside. She was wearing a yellow raincoat over what appeared to be pajamas, and her feet were tucked into small rain boots that were clearly too big for her. "My mama saw you sleeping out here," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She made extra soup tonight, and she wanted me to bring you some. It's chicken noodle, and it's really good. Mama makes the best soup in the whole world." She held the bowl toward him with both hands, her small arms trembling slightly from the weight and the cold night air. Daniel stared at the child, unable to process what was happening. Kindness had become so foreign to him over the past few weeks that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like. His first instinct was to politely decline, to maintain what little dignity he had left, but the genuine concern in the girl's eyes made it impossible to turn away. I don't have any money," he managed to say, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. "Mama said it's free," the girl replied, still holding the bowl toward him. "She said everybody needs help sometimes, and tonight it's your turn to get help. Tomorrow, maybe you can help somebody else." The simple wisdom of her words, delivered with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children possess, broke something inside Daniel. He felt tears welling up in his eyes as he reached for the bowl, his hands shaking as they made contact with the warm ceramic. The soup was indeed the best he'd ever tasted. The broth was rich and comforting, filled with tender pieces of chicken and perfectly cooked noodles. As he ate, the little girl remained by his window, watching him with satisfaction. "What's your name?" Daniel asked between spoonfuls, realizing that this child had shown him more kindness than he'd experienced in weeks. "I'm Lucy," she said, bouncing slightly on her toes. "Lucy Murphy. My mama owns the diner. She's really nice, and she makes the best food. What's your name, mister?" There was no judgment in her question, only genuine curiosity and friendliness. "I'm Daniel," he replied, managing a smile for the first time in days. "This soup is incredible, Lucy. Please tell your mama thank you for me." He wanted to say more, to express how much this simple act of kindness meant to him, but the words felt inadequate. Lucy beamed at his praise. "Mama's inside if you want to tell her yourself. She's cleaning up, but she always has time to talk to people. She says that's what makes a diner special, talking to people and making them feel better." She pointed toward the warm glow emanating from the diner's windows, where Daniel could see a figure moving around inside. Something in Lucy's innocent invitation stirred a courage that Daniel hadn't felt in weeks. Maybe it was the warmth of the soup in his belly, or the kindness of this child, or simply the human need for connection. After days of isolation, he found himself saying, "Maybe I will go thank her. Would that be okay?" Lucy nodded enthusiastically. She'd like that. She worries about people, especially when they're sleeping in their cars. She says everybody has a story, and sometimes people just need someone to listen. The child's words revealed a wisdom beyond her years, clearly influenced by a mother who had taught her about compassion and understanding. Daniel finished the soup and handed the empty bowl back to Lucy. As he stepped out of his car, he realized how stiff his joints had become from sleeping in cramped positions. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of spring rain and the lingering aromas from the diner's kitchen. Lucy walked beside him, toward the diner's entrance, her small hand slipping into his with a trust that both humbled and terrified him. The diner's interior was everything Daniel had imagined, and more. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. The counter was topped with checkered linoleum, and behind it, a grill and coffee station that looked well-maintained but clearly vintage. The walls were covered with local memorabilia, photos of community events, and handwritten thank you notes from customers. It was the kind of place that existed in every small town, a gathering place where everyone knew everyone else's business and genuinely cared about their neighbors. Behind the counter stood a woman in her mid-30s with the same auburn hair as Lucy, pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore a flour-dusted apron over jeans and a simple sweater, and her hands were busy wiping down the counter with methodical precision. When she looked up and saw Daniel and Lucy approaching, her face broke into a warm smile that immediately put him at ease. "You must be Daniel," she said, extending a hand that was both strong and gentle. "I'm Sarah Murphy. Lucy told me she was bringing you some soup. I hope you liked it." Her voice carried the slight accent of someone who had lived in the same small town their entire life, but there was no condescension in her tone, only genuine warmth. "It was incredible," Daniel replied, shaking her hand. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness. I don't know what to say." He felt embarrassed by his appearance, suddenly aware of how he must look after days of sleeping in his car, but Sarah's expression remained unchanged. "You don't need to say anything," Sarah replied, already moving toward the coffee pot. "But you look like you could use some coffee to go with that soup. Have a seat wherever you'd like." She gestured toward the empty booths, and Daniel chose one near the window where he could keep an eye on his car. As Sarah poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug, she continued talking in a casual, comfortable way that made Daniel feel like a welcomed guest rather than a charity case. "Lucy has been watching for you the past few nights. She's got a good heart, that one. Too good sometimes, according to her teachers." She smiled fondly at her daughter, who had climbed onto the stool at the counter and was swinging her legs contentedly. "I'm sorry if I've been a disturbance," Daniel said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "I didn't mean to worry anyone, especially not a child. I've just been going through a rough patch. and I'm hoping things will turn around soon. He wanted to be honest without burdening these kind strangers with his problems. Sarah settled into the booth across from him, her own mug of coffee in hand. "We've all been through rough patches," she said simply. "This place has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandmother started it during the Depression, and she used to say that the mark of a community isn't how it treats its most successful members, but how it treats those who are struggling." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Daniel had experienced in months. Sarah didn't pry into his circumstances or offer empty platitudes about everything working out. Instead, she talked about the town, the diner, and the challenges of running a small business in an increasingly corporate world. She told him about customers who had become friends, about the seasonal rhythms of a small town, and about the satisfaction of providing a place where people could find comfort and community. Lucy, meanwhile, had produced a coloring book and was working on a picture of a castle while listening to the adult conversation. Occasionally, she would chime in with observations about the town or questions about Daniel's life that were innocent but perceptive. "Do you have kids?" she asked at one point. And when Daniel told her about Emma, Lucy's face lit up with excitement. "Is she my age? Does she like to color? Maybe she could come to the diner sometime and we could color together." The child's enthusiasm was infectious, and Daniel found himself smiling as he described Emma's love of art and her dream of becoming a teacher when she grew up. As the night wore on, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of belonging and acceptance. Sarah refilled his coffee mug several times, and when she noticed him eyeing the pie case, she cut him a generous slice of apple pie, claiming it would go bad if someone didn't eat it soon. The lie was transparent, but delivered with such kindness that Daniel didn't protest. Around 1 a.m., Sarah began the process of closing the diner for the night. She moved efficiently through her routine, wiping down surfaces, checking the grill, and preparing for the next day's opening. Lucy had fallen asleep at the counter, her head resting on her coloring book, and Daniel offered to carry her to the car. As he lifted the small girl, he was struck by how light she was, how vulnerable, and how much trust her mother had shown in allowing a stranger to see her. "Hold her, child. She likes you," Sarah said as they walked toward her car. "Lucy's usually shy around new people, but she's got good instincts about character. She knew you were someone worth helping." She opened the back door of her sedan, and Daniel gently placed Lucy in her car seat, tucking her jacket around her small frame. As they stood in the parking lot, Sarah turned to Daniel with a serious expression. "Look, I know this might sound presumptuous, but I've been watching you these past few nights, and I recognize someone who's hit a rough patch. If you're looking for work, I could use some help in the kitchen. It's not much, just washing dishes and basic prep work, but it comes with meals and a small paycheck. You'd be doing me a favor, actually. I've been trying to handle everything myself, and I'm starting to wear down." Daniel stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. "You don't even know me," he said quietly. "You don't know anything about my situation or my background. How do you know I'm not dangerous or unreliable?" Sarah smiled, the same warm expression he'd seen all evening. "I know you accepted soup from a 7-year-old girl without question. I know you've been sleeping in your car for days without causing any trouble or bothering anyone. I know you carried my daughter to the car like she was made of glass. And I know you've been nothing but polite and grateful despite whatever circumstances brought you here. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The offer hung in the air between them, and Daniel felt the weight of possibilities settling on his shoulders. It wasn't a solution to all his problems, but it was a start, a chance to begin rebuilding his life. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "I've been looking for work for weeks, and no one would even give me an interview. Why are you willing to take a chance on me?" "Because someone took a chance on my family once," Sarah replied. "When my husband died 4 years ago, I didn't know the first thing about running a business. I had a 7-month-old baby and a diner that was failing. The bank was ready to foreclose, and I was about to lose everything. But this community rallied around us. Customers started paying their bills in advance, local suppliers extended credit, and people volunteered their time to help keep the place running. I learned that sometimes the best investment you can make is in another person's potential." Daniel felt tears welling up in his eyes again, overwhelmed by the generosity and faith this woman was showing him. "I won't let you down," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired. I'll do whatever needs to be done." "I know you will," Sarah said simply. "Can you start tomorrow morning? We open at 6 a.m., but if you come in at 5:30 a.m., I can show you around and get you started. The pay isn't much, about $10 an hour to start, but you get a meal with each shift, and if things work out, we can talk about increases down the road." Daniel nodded eagerly, already calculating how the money would help him start getting back on his feet. It wouldn't be enough to immediately get an apartment, but it would cover gas, phone bills, and basic necessities. Most importantly, it would give him something to tell Emma when she came home, a sign that he was fighting his way back to stability. As Sarah drove away with Lucy sleeping in the back seat, Daniel returned to his car feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The Honda Civic was still cramped and uncomfortable, but now it felt like temporary shelter rather than a permanent prison. He had a job, he had met kind people who believed in him, and for the first time since losing his position at Romanos, he had hope. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Murphy's Diner at 5:20 a.m., 10 minutes early, and determined to make a good impression. He'd used the community center's facilities to shower and shave, and he put on his cleanest clothes. Sarah was already there, preparing for the day's opening, and she greeted him with the same warm smile he remembered from the night before. "Ready for your first day?" she asked, handing him an apron that read Murphy's Diner in faded blue letters. "I'll start you off easy, just washing dishes and helping with food prep. Once you get comfortable with the routine, we can expand your responsibilities." The kitchen was small but well organized, with everything in its proper place. Sarah showed him the dishwashing station, explained the diner system for organizing clean dishes, and introduced him to the prep work that needed to be done each morning. It was familiar work, similar to what he'd done at Romanos, and Daniel felt comfortable immediately. As the morning progressed and customers began arriving for breakfast, Daniel threw himself into his tasks with an intensity that surprised even him. He washed dishes with meticulous care, chopped vegetables with precise consistency, and kept his work area spotless. When Sarah needed extra help during the breakfast rush, he stepped in seamlessly, his experience as a line cook allowing him to anticipate needs and work efficiently under pressure. The regular customers were curious about the new employee, and Sarah introduced him simply as Daniel, our new kitchen helper. There was no mention of his circumstances or how he'd come to work there, just acceptance and inclusion. "Mrs. Peterson?" An elderly woman who apparently came in every morning for coffee and toast made a point of thanking him for keeping her coffee cup full. Frank, a construction worker who ordered the same breakfast every day, complimented the perfectly cooked eggs and asked Daniel where he'd learned to cook. During his break, Daniel sat in the same booth where he talked with Sarah the night before, eating a breakfast that tasted better than any meal he'd had in months. Lucy appeared at his table, carrying her coloring book and a box of crayons. "Mama said you work here now," she said, climbing into the booth across from him. "Does that mean you won't have to sleep in your car anymore?" The question was asked with the innocent directness of a child, and Daniel realized that Lucy understood his situation better than he'd given her credit for. "I hope so," he said honestly. "Your mama gave me a job, and that's the first step toward getting back on my feet. It might take some time, but I'm going to work really hard to make things better." Lucy nodded solemnly, then brightened as she opened her coloring book. "I made you a picture," she said, tearing out a page and handing it to him. It was a drawing of a man standing in front of a diner, with a little girl beside him holding a bowl. The figures were simple but recognizable, and at the bottom, in careful first-grade handwriting, she had written, "Daniel and Lucy, best friends." Daniel stared at the drawing, feeling his throat tighten with emotion. "This is beautiful, Lucy. Thank you so much. I'm going to keep this forever." He carefully folded the paper and put it in his wallet, right next to the photo of Emma. As the days passed, Daniel settled into a routine that felt both familiar and hopeful. He would arrive at the diner early, work through the breakfast and lunch rushes, and spend his evenings either looking for more permanent housing or simply sitting in the diner's parking lot, reading library books and planning for Emma's return. Sarah had offered to let him shower at her house, which was Camarie, just a few blocks away. and had even suggested he could do his laundry there. The work itself was satisfying in ways Daniel hadn't expected. There was something therapeutic about the rhythm of washing dishes, the precision required for food prep, and the satisfaction of contributing to something larger than himself. The diner's customers became familiar faces, and many of them made a point of chatting with him during slower periods. He learned about their families, their jobs, and their concerns, and he began to feel like a part of the community rather than an outsider looking in. Sarah proved to be an excellent boss, patient when he made mistakes, encouraging when he showed initiative, and understanding when he needed time to handle personal matters. She never asked intrusive questions about his past or his plans for the future, but she made it clear that she valued his contributions and was invested in his success. One afternoon, while Daniel was preparing vegetables for the next day's soup, Sarah approached him with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," she said, "about your situation with housing. I know you're still sleeping in your car, and with your daughter coming home soon, you're going to need a more permanent solution." Daniel looked up from his cutting board, immediately worried that he was about to lose the small stability he'd gained. "I've been looking for apartments," he said quickly. "I know I can't keep parking behind the diner indefinitely. I just need a little more time to save up for a deposit and first month's rent." Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "That's not where I'm getting at. There's a small apartment above the diner, just a one-bedroom place, where my grandmother used to live. It's not much, but it's clean and furnished, and it would be perfect for you and Emma. I've been using it for storage, but I could clear it out if you're interested." Daniel stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. "You want to rent it to me? I don't think I can afford market-rate rent, even with the job here." "I'm not talking about market rate," Sarah said with a smile. "I'm talking about a work-study arrangement. You'd pay a small amount for utilities, maybe $100 a month, and in exchange, you'd take on some additional responsibilities around the diner. Some light maintenance, helping with inventory, maybe some cooking when I need an extra hand. It would be a good deal for both of us." The offer was so generous that Daniel felt overwhelmed. "Sarah, I can't let you do this. You've already done so much for me. You gave me a job when no one else would. You've fed me. You've shown me more kindness than I deserve. I can't take advantage of your generosity." "You're not taking advantage of anything," Sarah replied firmly. "You're one of the hardest workers I've ever employed. You show up early, you stay late when needed. You've learned everything I've taught you, and you've improved the efficiency of my kitchen significantly. This isn't charity, Daniel. This is a business arrangement that benefits both of us." Daniel felt tears welling up in his eyes as he realized what this meant. Emma would have a home to come back to. He would have a stable place to live, a job that provided both income and purpose, and a community that had accepted him. It was more than he had dared to hope for just a week ago. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've given me back my life." Sarah smiled, the same warm expression that had greeted him that first night. "You don't need to thank me. Just keep being the person you are, and help me make this diner the best it can be. That's all the thanks I need." The apartment above the diner was indeed small, but it was perfect for Daniel and Emma. It had a bedroom with a double bed, a small living area with a couch and television, and a kitchenette with a refrigerator and microwave. The bathroom was tiny but functional, and the windows overlooked Main Street, providing a view of the small town's daily rhythms. Sarah had cleared out the storage items and had even added some personal touches. Fresh flowers on the table and clean linens on the bed. Daniel spent his first night in the apartment lying on the soft mattress, staring at the ceiling and trying to process how dramatically his life had changed in just 1 week, a month ago. He'd been a struggling single father, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. 2 weeks ago, he'd been homeless and hopeless, sleeping in his car and wondering how he would provide for his daughter. Now, he had a home, a job, and a community that had embraced him. The next morning, Daniel called Emma at her grandmother's house. Her excited voice filled the small apartment as she told him about her adventures, the places she'd visited, and the things she'd learned. When he told her about the new apartment and his job at the diner, she was thrilled. "You work at a real diner, Daddy? Like in the movies?" Do they have milkshakes and pie and everything? Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Daniel found himself describing Murphy's diner in detail, telling her about Sarah and Lucy, about the regular customers, and about the apartment where they would live. "I can't wait to see it," Emma said, "and I want to meet Lucy. She sounds really nice. Do you think she'll want to be my friend?" Daniel smiled, thinking about the drawing Lucy had made for him. "I think she's going to love you, sweetheart. She's been asking about you every day." When Emma returned from her grandmother's house 3 days later, Daniel was waiting in the apartment, nervous and excited about her reaction. Margaret had driven Emma to the diner personally, curious about the new living situation and protective of her granddaughter's welfare. Daniel understood her concerns and was prepared to answer any questions she might have. Emma burst through the apartment door like a small tornado, her eyes wide with excitement as she took in their new home. "Daddy, this is so cool! We live above a diner. Can we eat there every day? Where's my room? Can I see the kitchen?" Her questions came rapid fire, and Daniel laughed as he gave her a tour of their small but comfortable space. The bedroom had been set up with a bed for Emma near the window, where she could watch the activity on Main Street. Daniel had hung some of her artwork on the walls and had arranged her toys and books on a small shelf. It wasn't the bedroom she'd had in their old apartment, but it was clean and comfortable and filled with love. Margaret was clearly impressed with the arrangement, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of parental concern. "It's quite small," she said, looking around the apartment. "Are you sure this is suitable for raising a child?" "It's perfect for us," Daniel replied, his arm around Emma's shoulders. "It's clean, it's safe, and it's ours. Emma will have everything she needs, and she'll be part of a community that cares about her." As if summoned by his words, Lucy appeared at the apartment door, having heard voices and come to investigate. She was wearing a sundress and had her hair in pigtails, and she clutched a small wrapped package in her hands. "Is this Emma?" she asked shyly, peering around Daniel's legs. Emma stepped forward with the confidence of a child who had never met a stranger. "Hi, I'm Emma. Are you Lucy? My daddy told me all about you. He said you make the best soup in the world, and that you're really nice." Lucy beamed at the compliment and held out her package. "I made you a welcome present," she said. "It's a picture of our diner, and I wrote your name on it. Do you want to see my coloring books? I have lots of them." Within minutes, the two girls were sitting on the floor, coloring and chattering as if they'd known each other for years. Margaret watched the interaction with growing approval, and Daniel could see her relaxing as she observed how comfortable Emma was in her new environment. "This is quite a transformation," Margaret said quietly, so the girls wouldn't hear. 3 weeks ago, you were devastated about losing your job. Now you seem to have landed on your feet in a remarkable way." Daniel nodded, still amazed by the turn his life had taken. "I got lucky. I met people who were willing to give me a chance when I needed it most. Sarah and Lucy saved my life in ways they probably don't even realize." Margaret looked around the apartment again, this time with approval rather than concern. "Emma seems happy. That's what matters most. But Daniel, if you ever need anything, if this arrangement doesn't work out, you know you can call me. Emma is my granddaughter, and I want what's best for her." "I know," Daniel replied, "and I appreciate everything you've done for us. But I think this is going to work out just fine. Emma will be happy here, and she'll have opportunities she wouldn't have had in a big city." Over the following weeks, Daniel and Emma settled into their new life with remarkable ease. Emma enrolled in the local elementary school, where she quickly made friends and impressed her teachers with her intelligence and creativity. She would walk to school each morning, then come to the diner after school to do her homework at one of the booths while Daniel finished his workday. The arrangement worked perfectly for everyone involved. Emma loved being part of the diner's daily routine, and the regular customers quickly adopted her as their unofficial mascot. Mrs. Peterson would help her with math homework. Frank would tell her stories about his construction projects, and several other customers would bring her small gifts or treats. She became particularly close to Lucy, and the two girls would spend hours coloring, playing games, and creating elaborate imaginary worlds. Daniel's role at the diner continued to expand as Sarah recognized his skills and dedication. He began taking on more cooking responsibilities, creating daily specials that quickly became customer favorites. His chicken and dumplings were so popular that Sarah added them to the regular menu, and his homemade bread brought in customers from neighboring towns. The work was demanding, but rewarding. Daniel felt useful and valued in ways he hadn't experienced in years. He was contributing to something meaningful, creating food that brought comfort and joy to people's lives. The financial compensation was modest but adequate, and combined with the low-cost housing arrangement, he was able to save money for the first time in years. 3 months after starting at Murphy's Diner, Daniel had saved enough money to buy Emma a bicycle for her birthday. It was a small gesture, but it represented so much more than a simple gift. It was a symbol of stability, of a father who could provide for his daughter's wants, as well as her needs. Emma's joy, when she saw the bright red bike, was worth every extra hour Daniel had worked to afford it. The birthday party was held at the diner, with Sarah closing early so the entire space could be dedicated to the celebration. Customers who had become friends contributed to the festivities, bringing gifts, decorations, and homemade treats. Lucy had spent weeks planning a special surprise, a hand-drawn comic book featuring Emma as a superhero who saved the world with her kindness and creativity. As Daniel watched his daughter blow out the candles on her homemade cake, surrounded by people who had become family, he felt a contentment he hadn't experienced since before his divorce. This wasn't just about having a roof over their heads or steady employment. This was about belonging to something larger than themselves, about being part of a community that valued and supported each other. 6 months into his employment at Murphy's Diner, Daniel received news that would test everything he built. Sarah approached him one evening after closing, her expression serious in a way that immediately put him on alert. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, sitting down across from him at their usual booth. "I got a call from a restaurant chain today. They're interested in buying the diner." Daniel felt his stomach drop. The diner had become more than just his workplace. It was his home, his community, his entire world. "Are you considering selling?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sarah sighed, running her hands through her hair. "I don't want to. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. They're offering enough money to secure Lucy's college education and give us financial security. I've never had. But selling would mean losing everything this place represents. It would mean letting down all the people who depend on us, including you." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult Daniel had ever had. He understood Sarah's dilemma completely. As a single parent, he knew the constant worry about providing for your child's future, the weight of making decisions that would affect not just your own life, but the life of someone you loved more than anything. At the same time, he couldn't imagine losing the stability and community he'd found at Murphy's Diner. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you," Daniel said finally. "You've given me more than I ever could have hoped for. If selling is what's best for you and Lucy, then that's what you should do. I'll figure something out." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then smiled. "You know what? I'm not going to sell. This place is worth more than money. It's worth the relationships we've built, the community we've created, and the lives we've touched. Besides, I couldn't live with myself if I displaced you and Emma after everything you've been through." The relief Daniel felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by a new understanding of how precarious their situation really was. That night, lying in bed and listening to Emma's peaceful breathing, he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find a way to ensure that Murphy's Diner would never again be threatened by financial instability. The next morning, Daniel approached several of the diner's regular customers with an idea that had been forming in his mind. What if the community could come together to support the diner in a more substantial way? What if they could create a system that would provide Sarah with the financial security she needed while preserving the diner's character and mission? Frank, the construction worker who had become one of Daniel's closest friends, was immediately interested. "I've been coming here for 15 years, he said. "This place is the heart of our community. If there's a way to keep it going, I'm in." Mrs. Peterson, despite her advanced age, proved to be surprisingly savvy about business matters. "My late husband was a banker," she explained. "I understand how these things work. We need to think about this systematically, create a plan that makes sense financially and legally." Over the following weeks, Daniel organized a series of meetings with interested community members. One emerged was a plan to create a community investment fund that would provide Sarah with the financial resources she needed while keeping the diner locally owned and operated. Investors would purchase shares in the diner's future success, receiving modest returns while ensuring the business remained viable. The plan was ambitious and complex, requiring legal documentation, financial projections, and a level of organization that Daniel had never attempted before. But the response from the community was overwhelming. Local business owners, longtime customers, and even some newcomers to the town expressed interest in participating. The small-town accountant volunteered to help with the financial planning. The local lawyer offered to handle the legal documentation at a reduced rate, and the bank president agreed to provide guidance on structuring the investment fund. Sarah was initially skeptical of the plan, worried about the complexity and the potential for conflict with community investors. But as Daniel presented the details, and she saw the level of support from her customers, she began to see the possibilities. "This could work," she said after reviewing the preliminary documents. "It's not just about the money. It's about creating a sustainable model that ensures the diner will be here for future generations." The fundraising campaign that followed was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Daniel organized events, created promotional materials, and spoke at community meetings about the importance of preserving local businesses. Emma and Lucy became unofficial ambassadors for the cause, distributing flyers and charming potential investors with their enthusiasm for the project. The goal was to raise $50,000, enough to provide Sarah with a financial cushion while funding some necessary improvements to the diner. Within 6 weeks, they had not only reached their goal, but exceeded it, raising over $60,000 for more than 100 community members. The celebration was held at the diner on a Saturday evening, with the entire restaurant filled with investors, supporters, and well-wishers. Daniel stood at the front of the room, looking out at the faces of people who had become family, and felt a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond personal success. "6 months ago, I was sleeping in my car in this parking lot," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "I had lost everything I thought was important, my job, my home, my sense of purpose. But this community, this diner, and especially Sarah and Lucy Murphy, showed me that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of tasks. Finding something better." He paused, looking at Emma, who was sitting with Lucy at their favorite booth, both girls beaming with pride. "They showed me that success isn't just about what you can accumulate for yourself. It's about what you can build with others, what you can contribute to something larger than yourself." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, but Daniel wasn't finished. "This investment fund isn't just about saving a diner. It's about proving that communities can come together to preserve the things that matter most. It's about showing that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they work together." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Daniel found himself alone with Sarah and the girls. Lucy had fallen asleep in her booth, exhausted from the excitement of the evening, and Emma was helping to clean up the celebration decorations. "I can't believe what you've accomplished," Sarah said, shaking her head in amazement. 6 months ago, you were a man in crisis. Now you've organized one of the most successful community fundraising campaigns this town has ever seen. You've shown leadership, vision, and determination that I never could have imagined." Daniel smiled, feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition. "I had good teachers," he said. "You and Lucy taught me about kindness and community. The customers taught me about the importance of relationships and trust. Emma taught me about resilience and hope. I just took what I learned and tried to give back." The success of the investment fund marked a turning point not just for Murphy's Diner, but for Daniel's role in the community. Word of his organizational skills and community leadership spread beyond the town limits, and he began receiving requests to help other local businesses and organizations with their challenges. A struggling hardware store in the next town asked for his help in organizing a similar community investment campaign. A local food bank needed assistance with volunteer coordination and fundraising. The school district invited him to join a committee focused on improving parent and community engagement. Daniel found himself becoming a recognized leader in the region, known for his ability to bring people together around common goals. But he never forgot where it all started, and he never lost sight of the values that had guided him through his darkest hours. A year after the investment fund's success, Daniel was approached by the state's Department of Economic Development about a position as a community development specialist. The job would involve traveling throughout the state, helping rural communities develop strategies for economic sustainability and growth. The salary was substantial, far more than he'd ever earned, and the position came with excellent benefits and opportunities for advancement. It was the kind of opportunity that most people in his situation would have jumped at immediately. But Daniel found himself conflicted. The job would mean leaving Murphy's Diner, leaving the community that had saved him, and potentially disrupting the stable life he'd built with Emma. He discussed the opportunity with Sarah, who was characteristically supportive and practical. "This is exactly the kind of break you deserve," she said. "You've proven yourself as a leader and an organizer. You have skills that could help communities throughout the state. I think you'd be crazy not to take it." "But what about the diner?" Daniel asked. "What about Emma's stability? What about everything we've built here?" Sarah smiled, the same warm expression he'd seen that first night when she'd offered him soup through a car window. "The diner will be fine. You've helped us create a sustainable model that doesn't depend on any one person. And Emma is strong and adaptable. She'll thrive wherever you go, as long as she has you." The decision was ultimately made easier by Emma herself. When Daniel explained the opportunity to her, she listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and then surprised him with her response. "Daddy, you always taught me that when you have a chance to help people, you should take it. This job sounds like you could help lots of people, not just our town. I think you should do it. We can always come back to visit." Lucy and Mrs. Murphy. Daniel realized that his 8-year-old daughter had inherited his capacity for seeing beyond immediate circumstances to larger possibilities. Her willingness to embrace change and support his career growth made his decision clear. He accepted the position with the state, but not before working with Sarah to ensure a smooth transition at the diner. He trained his replacement, a young man from a neighboring town who reminded Daniel of himself a year earlier, someone who needed a chance and was willing to work hard to prove himself worthy of it. The farewell celebration at Murphy's Diner was bittersweet. The community that had embraced Daniel and Emma gathered to wish them well, sharing stories, exchanging contact information, and promising to stay in touch. Lucy presented Emma with a photo album filled with pictures of their adventures together, while Sarah gave Daniel a framed copy of the diner's original menu from 1935, signed by all the Baya. "Community investors. This is to remind you where you came from," Sarah said as she presented the gift. "But more importantly, it's to remind you of what you're capable of. You came here with nothing but determination and character. You're leaving as a proven leader who has made a lasting impact on this community." Daniel's new position exceeded all his expectations. He traveled throughout the state, working with communities facing economic challenges, helping them develop strategies for revitalization and growth. He organized community investment funds, facilitated discussions between local businesses and potential investors, and provided training on leadership and community organizing. Each community he worked with was different, with unique challenges and opportunities. But the fundamental principles remained the same. People working together could accomplish things that seemed impossible when attempted alone. Trust, communication, and shared vision were the foundations of successful community development. Emma thrived in their new environment. The state capital offered educational opportunities that hadn't been available in their small town, and she excelled in advanced programs for gifted students. She joined a debate team, participated in science fairs, and continued to develop her artistic talents. But she never forgot her roots, and she would often incorporate stories from Murphy's Diner into her school projects and presentations. 2 years into his new position, Daniel received a call that would bring his journey full circle. The state's Department of Economic Development had been contacted by a national foundation interested in funding a program to address rural homelessness and economic displacement. They wanted Daniel to develop and lead a pilot program that would provide comprehensive support to individuals and families facing economic crisis. The program Daniel designed was based on everything he'd learned from his own experience and his work with communities throughout the state. It would provide temporary housing, job training, counseling services, and most importantly, community integration support. The goal wasn't just to help people find jobs and housing, but to help them build the relationships and connections that would provide long-term stability and opportunity. The pilot program launched with sites in 5 rural communities, each partnering with local businesses, churches, and community organizations. Daniel hired a team of counselors, job trainers, and community coordinators, many of whom had personal experience with homelessness or economic displacement. The program's first client was a single mother named Maria, who had lost her job at a textile factory and been evicted from her apartment. She arrived at the program site with her 2 young children, carrying everything they owned in a few plastic bags. Daniel saw in her the same desperation and determination he'd felt that night behind Murphy's Diner, and he was committed to ensuring her story would have a different ending. Working with the local community, Daniel's team found Maria temporary housing with a family who had volunteered to be a host home. They enrolled her in a medical assistant training program at the local community college, provided childcare support, and connected her with local employers who had committed to hiring program graduates. More importantly, they helped Maria build relationships within the community. She joined a local church, her children enrolled in community sports programs, and she began volunteering at the local food bank. Within 6 months, Maria had completed her training, found full-time employment, and moved into her own apartment. But unlike the traditional model of social services, the support didn't end there. The program continued to check in with Maria, providing ongoing counseling and support as needed. When she faced a transportation challenge that threatened her job, the program helped her secure a reliable vehicle. When her oldest child struggled with the academic transition, they connected her with tutoring resources. The goal was to ensure that temporary assistance led to long-term stability and success. Word of the program's success spread quickly. Other states requested information about the model, and Daniel found himself invited to speak at conferences and workshops about innovative approaches to addressing homelessness and economic displacement. The small-town diner dishwasher had become a recognized expert in community development and social policy. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Daniel received a letter from a man named Robert, who had been living in his car behind a grocery store in one of the pilot program communities. Robert had been reluctant to seek help, ashamed of his circumstances and convinced that he had nothing to offer anyone. "I saw your story in the local newspaper," Robert wrote, "about how you went from sleeping in your car to running this program. It gave me hope that maybe my situation wasn't permanent. I contacted your program, and they helped me get back on my feet. But more than that, they helped me realize that my experience had value, that I could use what I'd learned to help others." Robert had completed job training as a peer counselor and had been hired by the program to work with new clients. His lived experience with homelessness, combined with his natural empathy and communication skills, made him extraordinarily effective at connecting with people in crisis. "I wanted to thank you," Robert continued, "not just for creating this program, but for showing me that our lowest moments don't define us. What defines us is what we choose to do with the lessons we learn from those moments." The letter arrived on a particularly difficult day, when Daniel was struggling with budget constraints and political pressure to reduce the program's scope. Robert's words reminded him of why the work mattered, of the human faces behind the statistics and policy discussions. 3 years after the pilot program's launch, Daniel was invited to present the results to a congressional committee considering federal funding for similar initiatives. The statistics were impressive: an 85% success rate in helping participants find stable housing and employment, significant reductions in repeat homelessness, and measurable improvements in child welfare and educational outcomes. But Daniel chose to focus his presentation on the stories rather than the numbers. He told the committee about Maria, who had gone from homeless single mother to certified medical assistant and community volunteer. He spoke about Robert, who had transformed from a man sleeping in his car to a peer counselor helping others navigate their own crises. "The most important thing we've learned," Daniel concluded, "is that homelessness and economic displacement are not character flaws or personal failures. They are systemic problems that require systemic solutions. But those solutions must be rooted in human dignity, community support, and the recognition that every person has value and potential." End quote. The committee was impressed enough to include funding for the program in their budget recommendations, ensuring that the model could be expanded to communities throughout the country. Daniel felt a deep satisfaction knowing that his own experience of homelessness had contributed to creating resources that would help thousands of other people avoid or overcome similar crises. As Daniel prepared to leave the congressional hearing, he was approached by a young aide who had been taking notes throughout the presentation. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "I was wondering if you could tell me more about the diner where your story started. I grew up in a small town with a similar place, and I'm curious about how communities like that can be supported and preserved." Daniel smiled, thinking about Sarah and Lucy, about the community that had embraced him when he had nothing to offer but gratitude and determination. "That's a longer conversation," he said, "but I'd be happy to share what I've learned. The short version is that small communities have incredible power to transform lives, but they need support and resources to maintain that power." Oh. The conversation that followed led to another opportunity. The aide, whose name was Jennifer, worked for a senator who was interested in rural development and small business support. She arranged for Daniel to meet with the senator's staff to discuss policy initiatives that could strengthen small communities and the local businesses that served as their economic and social centers. The meeting resulted in Daniel being invited to serve on a federal task force focused on rural economic development. The position would allow him to continue his work with the Homeless Services Program, while also contributing to policy discussions about supporting small towns and local businesses. It was a remarkable opportunity, but Daniel found himself thinking about the path that had led him to this moment. 5 years ago, he had been a desperate man sleeping in his car behind a small-town diner. Now, he was being asked to help shape federal policy that could affect millions of people in similar communities. The irony wasn't lost on him. His greatest professional success had grown directly from his most profound personal failure. The experience of losing everything had taught him lessons about resilience, community, and human dignity that no amount of traditional education or career advancement could have provided. Emma, now 13, and wise beyond her years, had watched her father's transformation with a mixture of pride and understanding that impressed everyone who met her. She had learned from his example that setbacks could become opportunities, that kindness from strangers could change lives, and that success meant more than personal achievement. "I want to do what you do when I grow up," she told Daniel one evening as they sat in their apartment, reviewing applications for the expanded Homeless Services Program. "I want to help people who are going through hard times, like we did." Daniel looked at his daughter, seeing in her the same determination and compassion that had gotten them through their darkest hours. "You can do anything you set your mind to," he said. "But remember, you don't have to wait until you're grown up to help people. You can start making a difference right now." Emma took his words to heart. She organized a clothing drive at her school for families in need, volunteered at the local food bank, and even convinced her debate team to participate in a community service project. Her teachers and classmates were impressed by her maturity and commitment to helping others. The ripple effects of Daniel's story continued to spread in ways he never could have anticipated. Sarah had used the success of the Community Investment Fund as a model for helping other small businesses in the region. She had become a consultant and advocate for community-supported commerce, helping dozens of local businesses create sustainable relationships with their customers and communities. Lucy, now 12 years old, had inherited her mother's entrepreneurial spirit and her honorary Uncle Daniel's commitment to community service. She had started a small business making and selling handmade crafts, donating a portion of her profits to local charities. Her success had inspired other young people in the community to start their own small businesses, creating a culture of entrepreneurship and social responsibility. Murphy's Diner had become more than just a local restaurant. It had become a symbol of community resilience and cooperation, attracting visitors from across the region who wanted to experience the atmosphere and learn about the innovative investment model. Sarah had written a book about the experience, sharing the lessons learned and providing a blueprint for other communities facing similar challenges. The diner's success had also created economic opportunities for the broader community. The increased foot traffic had benefited other local businesses, property values had risen, and the town had been able to invest in infrastructure improvements and community development projects. The positive economic cycle that had begun with one act of kindness had transformed the entire community. Daniel made it a point to visit Murphy's Diner at least once a year, bringing Emma and maintaining the relationships that had been so crucial to their survival and success. Each visit was a reminder of how far they had come and how much they owed to the community that had embraced them. During one such visit, Daniel sat in the same booth where he had first talked with Sarah about his circumstances. The diner looked much the same, but there were subtle improvements that reflected its success. Fresh paint, new equipment, and an expanded menu that featured some of the recipes Daniel had contributed during his time there. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Lucy hadn't knocked on your car window that night? Sarah asked, refilling his coffee cup with the same gesture she had made hundreds of times during his months as an employee. Daniel considered the question seriously. I think about it sometimes, he said. But I've learned that wondering about alternative histories isn't as useful as focusing on what actually happened and what we can learn from it. And what did you learn? Daniel smiled, looking around the diner at the familiar faces, the community bulletin board covered with announcements and thank you notes, the photos on the wall that now included pictures from the investment fund celebration and updates on former employees who had moved on to other opportunities. I learned that rock bottom can be a foundation, he said. I learned that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of wisdom. I learned that the most important thing you can do with your life is to use whatever you've been given, whether it's talents or experiences or opportunities, to make things better for other people. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. And I learned that sometimes the best investment you can make is in a person's potential rather than their current circumstances. You've proven that every day since you left here. As Daniel prepared to leave the diner that evening, Lucy, now a poised 12-year-old, presented him with a gift. It was a photo album filled with pictures from his time at the diner, but also with updates on all the people whose lives had been touched by his story. There were photos of program participants who had found stability and success, of communities that had implemented similar investment models, of young people who had been inspired by his example to pursue careers and by social service. This is what you started, Lucy said, her voice filled with pride. All of these people, all of these positive changes, they happened because you didn't give up, and because you chose to help others after you got back on your feet. Daniel felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked through the album. The scope of the impact was overwhelming. What had started as a simple act of kindness between a homeless man and a small-town diner had grown into a movement that was affecting thousands of lives across the country. But perhaps the most meaningful entry in the album was a letter from Robert, the man who had written to Daniel about finding hope in his story. Robert had included a photo of himself at his graduation ceremony, where he had received a degree in social work. He had also included a picture of his own family, a wife and 2 children who had supported him through his journey from homelessness to professional success. I wanted you to know, Robert had written, that your story didn't just help me find housing and employment. It helped me find purpose. I've decided to dedicate my career to helping other people who are facing the same challenges we faced. I'm opening a program in my community that's based on the model you created, and I'm naming it the Murphy's Diner Project, in honor of the place where your transformation began. Daniel closed the album and looked at Lucy, this remarkable young woman who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. Thank you, he said. This is the most meaningful gift I've ever received. As Daniel and Emma drove home that evening, they talked about the visit and about the lessons they had learned from their experience. Emma, now old enough to understand the full scope of what had happened, asked her father about the responsibility that came with their success. Do you ever feel pressure because so many people look up to you? She asked. Do you worry about disappointing them? Daniel considered the question carefully. I think about it sometimes, he said. But I'd learned that the best way to honor the people who helped us is to keep helping others. The pressure isn't to be perfect, it's to be useful. And what about me? Emma asked. Do I have a responsibility because of what happened to us? Daniel looked at his daughter, seeing in her the same compassion and determination that had gotten them through their darkest hours. You have the same responsibility that everyone has, he said. To use whatever you've been given to make the world a little better. The difference is that you've seen firsthand how much difference one person can make, and you've learned that setbacks don't define you, how you respond to them does. As they pulled into their driveway, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The small apartment above Murphy's Diner had been replaced by a comfortable house in a good neighborhood. The fear and uncertainty of those early days had been replaced by confidence and purpose. The isolation and desperation had been replaced by community and hope. But the most important transformation hadn't been in their circumstances. It had been in their understanding of what it meant to be successful. Success wasn't about accumulating wealth or achieving recognition. Success was about building relationships, contributing to community, and using your experiences to help others overcome their own challenges. Daniel's story had become a powerful example of how individual resilience and community support could create transformation that extended far beyond the original participants. The homeless services program he had created was now operating in 37 states, helping thousands of people transition from crisis to stability. The community investment model pioneered at Murphy's Diner had been replicated in over 200 communities, helping to preserve local businesses and strengthen rural economies. But perhaps the most important legacy of Daniel's story was the reminder that everyone has the potential to contribute something meaningful to the world, regardless of their current circumstances. The man who had once slept in his car behind a small-town diner had become a recognized expert in community development and social policy. The little girl who had brought him soup had grown into a young entrepreneur committed to social responsibility. The diner owner who had offered him a job had become a successful consultant and author. Each of them had taken the lessons learned from their shared experience and used them to create positive change in their communities and beyond. They had proven that kindness, when combined with determination and vision, could create ripple effects that lasted for generations. As Daniel tucked Emma into bed that night, she asked him one final question. "Daddy, do you think we'll ever be able to help someone the way Mrs. Murphy and Lucy helped us?" Daniel smiled, thinking about all the people they had already helped through the programs and initiatives they had created. "Sweetheart," he said, "I think we help people every day. Sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small ways. The important thing is to keep trying, to keep looking for opportunities to make a difference." Emma nodded, satisfied with his answer. "I love our story," she said. "Even the hard parts, because the hard parts made the good parts possible." Daniel kissed his daughter goodnight and reflected on her words. She was right. The hard parts had made the good parts possible. The night he had spent sleeping in his car behind Murphy's Diner had been one of the lowest points of his life, but it had also been the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of his story. The knock on his car window that night had been more than just an offer of soup. It had been an invitation to join a community, to become part of something larger than himself, and to discover that his greatest strength lay not in his ability to provide for himself, but in his capacity to contribute to the well-being of others. Years later, when Daniel was asked to speak at conferences or write articles about his experience, he would always return to that fundamental truth. The most important lesson he had learned wasn't about resilience or determination, though those qualities were certainly important. The most important lesson was about the power of human connection and the responsibility that came with both giving and receiving help. The story that had begun with a desperate man sleeping in his car had become a testament to the transformative power of kindness, community, and the belief that everyone has something valuable to contribute to the world. It was a story that continued to inspire and guide people facing their own challenges, reminding them that their current circumstances didn't define their future possibilities. And in small towns and big cities across the country, in programs and initiatives that bore the influence of Daniel's experience, people continued to discover that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of kindness: a bowl of soup offered to a stranger, a job given to someone who needed a chance, a community coming together to support what mattered most. The story of the single dad who was about to sleep in his car until a little girl knocked on his window holding soup had become more than just one family's journey from desperation to success. It had become a reminder that in a world that often seemed divided and disconnected, ordinary people still had the power to create extraordinary change, one act of kindness at a time.